Tensions have flared again on the China-Indian border. For the first time in decades, warning shots were fired in this remote area, and both sides say the other is responsible for encroachment and the increase in hostility. On Monday, the Chinese military said Indian troops were illegally trespassing on the line of actual control and urged them to withdraw. So what is going on there? Why the recent escalation between the Chinese and Indian troops? And how does the situation fit into the wider context? To talk about these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined by Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, and Professor Swarai Singh from the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Mahendra Subedi, a journalist and researcher based in Kathmandu. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So this is actually about unsettled border between China and India. Mr. Rong, yes, maybe two sides still haven't agreed on where the line of control is, but that line of control is situated in a remote, barren region. Why that line is important for both?
Well, this is, of course, a very complicated issue, but it's also important. As we all know that boundaries, lines are related to the, we call the territorial integrity and sovereignty. And as you rightly said, that China and India had a long border, had a long boundary, but have not been demarcated. But in the meantime, I think both China and India know very well there are lines of actual controls claimed by the two sides. And the two sides, both of them, particularly I mean for the frontier troops, they know what line, what position the other side is claiming. So when there's an incident that has been like the other side attempt or cross the line of actual control claimed by the other side, then problem erupt. And in the past years, we have seen many occasions, many incidents like that. And fortunately, the two sides has worked in a way that to manage these issues by following the protocols, agreements, and the norms. But this is the past 5 years, 5 months since April this year have seen kind of a rising tension caused by the Indians' attempt the building the infrastructure and by crossing illegally the line of actual control, causing big problem. And this is very unfortunate because the past 5 months have seen two unprecedented things. One was the casualties caused to the two sides. Secondly, which is even more worrying, is that the warring shots were fired, breaking a kind of 45 years of a situation where both sides claimed proudly in the past that despite the disputed boundaries, no single shots were fired. So we are now, I think, indeed a very serious and critical situation. We hope that the situation, wisdom will prevail, and maturity will be there, and certainly I think responsibility, sense of responsibility would also exercised so that this incident, the situation could be calmed down, and efforts, continued efforts to disengage and de-escalation will continue.
Mr. Singh, what do you think the nature of the recent clashes? Is it because of the different understanding where the line of control is?
I fully agree with my friend Rong Ying. It's partly because China and India were not territorial states. So if you look at the relationship between people of two sides, you don't see any tension. But both were subjugated by European colonial powers. And when both got liberated, they became territorial states for the first time. So therefore, you see this pride in their liberation or independence is often seen in their narratives on territorial sovereignty. And sometimes it looks very strange that despite being such large nation states, they both sides talk about every inch of their territory. That means the narratives are very clearly preoccupied with territorial sovereignty here. And both sides have also agreed that there is enormous variation in their perceptions, not only about the boundary line, but also even on the line of actual control. Now, what has happened is that we had both sides agreed about a dozen places where still there is confusion where the line of actual control is. Now, in the last 40 years, the world has seen unprecedented economic development of China, and also, to some extent, development of India, which has transformed these nations, given them enormous capabilities, including military capabilities, which then can showcase on the border much more effectively. So therefore, if we notice for about last 6 to 7 years, starting from 2013 in Chumar, 2014 in Tejsang, then of course 2015, again happening in Pangpong Lake area, then Doklam, and last year again in So fundamentally the frequency and intensity of these meetings have increased. For some time both sides had learned how to manage these, both at the place where the border is, soldiers could meet each other, but they will just go their way. We could also resolve sanctions, tensions diplomatically. But because of constant enormous rise, and particularly rise of China, which is unprecedented, we now both sides face an entirely new situation. And as Indian Foreign Minister says, we have to now find a new equilibrium of our transformed relationship. And therefore the old mannerisms, mechanisms and arrangements and treaties are perhaps proving ineffective, and therefore tensions are rising, tempers are rising. Despite agreements of not putting any quasi-permanent or permanent structures, we are seeing such structures being placed in areas where each side claims to be their own, but other side does not agree on those new force projections. And I think fundamentally the challenge lies in how to find that new equilibrium. And I hope both sides can work hard and find it faster, because the more it gets delayed, the more difficult it becomes, because accommodation and concessions begin to look like weakness and surrender, and both sides are very sensitive. And given the situation where India is now in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic, any concessions become extremely difficult in terms of domestic constituencies not willing to accept any such compromise on the border. So I think there are enormous challenges, but both sides' leaders are very determined, and they have repeatedly said they want to find solution in diplomatic negotiations. We are hoping today, in next few hours, as the two foreign ministers meet one-to-one in Moscow, they might at least provide some kind of broad direction. They may not resolve all issues, but they could initiate a kind of a direction which could potentially provide stability on the border and hopefully some solution in coming times.
And Mr. Singh just pointed out a very interesting point, that is the leaders from both sides are facing pressure from domestic audience. Mr. Rong, normally such an event will be well documented by a camera or witnesses, journalists, but that area is not like any city that we know. There are no video cameras and people capturing what happened on the ground. So that's why it's become a he said kind of story. What will be needed to be happening for us to know what really happened? Any kind of a documentation, video footages or witnesses' accounts that will buttress their narratives?
I think the question you raised is certainly important, because there are difficulties technically how to identify or demarcate the claimed the line of actual control. But I think this is not the key, not the point. The point is that, of course, even though it is a very difficult terrain, even though I think it's not technically difficult to do that, we have many technologies, not to mention satellites and others. So I think the point is not about the difficulties of understanding or following the positions of the other side. Rather, whether the other side should be able to respect the line of action control, which helped in the past few decades in managing and stabilizing in maintaining peace and tranquility along the border areas.
Can you give us some analysis why this happened at this time? Because we know that since the Doklam crisis, it seems has been quite a quiet situation along the border. Both sides decided to put their differences aside. Now, all of a sudden, this year, we see an increasing occurrences of clashes. Why at this time?
I think the most important thing is that the line of control should be respected, and there's no excuse to say that we do not know the other side claim the line of actual control. The Chinese know very well, and when the Chinese said that the line of actual control LC was crossed illegally by the Indian side know very well. So it is not a problem of not knowing. It is rather whether it would like to respect that. And the capabilities or the attempt to build up the infrastructure in the other sides of the border areas is something, I think, a new development. But I don't think it should be the excuse for not respect the line of actual control, which I think helped to stabilize the situation around the border. You mentioned the Doklam or Donglang incident 3 years ago. That was exactly the reason why the incident happened. And even though I think on the question on the sector of this, we call the Sikkim sector, there are very clear sort of agreement about the boundary line. But the sector, the western sector we are talking about, there are no sort of agreement on that, even though the line of actual control claimed by either the Chinese side or the Indian side are known to each other very well.
Mr. Singh, I want you to respond to that. There is an agreement on where the line of control is, but the Chinese has been saying it seems that the Indians no longer respect that agreement.
I think the sentiment, as you said in the opening remarks, is the same on both sides. Both sides think the other side is wrong. And that is simply because both leaders have said repeatedly that even on line of actual control, there are about a dozen places where there is still confusion on the ground. And western sector, as my friend Rong Ying just mentioned, is more complicated. There are more areas where confusion exists. And in fact, what we are seeing now is new gray areas. The points which were not in confusion are now becoming points of confusion. For example, Galwan Valley, or even the south of Pangong Lake. These are not areas which were in confusion.
But there is no confusion over the past two or three decades. Why there is confusion now?
Let me just add to what Rong Ying said on this very point. I was seeing this build-up happening over a period of time, and both countries should have anticipated an event or incident or tension of this nature coming anytime soon. I mentioned to you that in last 7 years, the ingressions, or at least alleged ingressions, were constantly increasing very rapidly. Number of encounters were increasing very rapidly. It was never like as frequent as this, and it was never as prolonged as before. So we had in 2013, in Debsang, for example, 16-day standoff, followed by next year in 2014 in Choar, another 21 days standoff in 2015 in Pangong Lake, as I mentioned to you. Then, of course, 72 days of Doklam crisis, followed by last year again. So the frequency and intensity and kind of persistence was constantly increasing. So this kind of tension would have come sooner or later. And it seems that we should have taken action much earlier to prepare ourselves to deal with such a situation.
Mr. Singh, there have been talks and negotiations between military commanders between both sides, and they agree to back down. But problems still arises. Do you think messages get lost in the chain of command in India, and do you also suspect that would be the case in China?
It is usually is what happens in such tense environment, that both sides, since they are building consensus under enormous pressure, they begin to also develop varying interpretations. So, for example, very simple things which are already written in agreements in black and white, things like neither side will change the status quo unilaterally. Neither side will put any permanent or quasi-permanent structures in areas which are not claimed before. So there are areas where Indian forces used to patrol and Chinese forces used to patrol, but it seems now that from April, Indian forces felt that they were not able to patrol those areas anymore. And among others, I'm particularly talking about the area between 8th and 4th finger on the north of
And another alarming thing,
so,
forgive me, Mr. Singh, is that whether bullets will be fired, because for 4 decades no bullets were fired along the border, and this time it happened. It is very alarming. This changed the rules of engagement along the border. China says India fired the first shot. Do you think that is the case?
I think we will not really easy to know. It might be, several years down the line when archives become available. But I want to underline a very important factor. Unlike our earlier encounters, it is, I think, something we all need to appreciate, that the soldiers, even in those tense moments, have been making videos. They videograph these events all the time, and that is a documentary evidence. And I think that will come out in these discussions, primarily between the two sides in closed-door meetings first, and maybe for the wider public later. But I want to underline the fact that on the Indian side, our not just government but private media has been going close to the line of actual control. Every day television reports with their reporters reporting from that area. So starting with the Kargil War of 1998, television in India constantly covers all such tensions or skirmishes on the border all the time. So in Indian case, a lot of it is being reported. I'm not saying that reporters were there at the moment of that firing that happened, but I believe soldiers obviously must have videographed some of that evidence, which will not become public very quickly, but will be very useful to exchange that videographed evidence on both sides.
About the sentiment among some of the Indian and Chinese people towards the border issue, we've also collected what some of them have been saying on the social media platforms. Let's take a look at what some of them have been saying. Jeffrey Gentleman said India is facing 3 crises: the fastest growing COVID crisis, the deepest slump of economy, and incessant trouble on the border with China. Many scholars say this is one of the toughest times India has faced since independence. So, Mr. Singh, India is obviously under a lot of stress, as this gentleman mentioned, economic slump and COVID surging, and also the border dispute. Do you think under such kind of stress, maybe it is more likely for Indian leaders to make wrong calls on some issues?
I think we are on the reverse. This is the worst time for India to think of opening any more fronts or creating more tensions, because Indian public is very, very, robustly, involved in all the policy-making decisions. And obviously, you have noticed the kind of anger that Indian public has shown, vis-a-vis Chinese, and forcing the government to ban several mobile applications, be more tough on investment regulations. So Indian government, I think, is not absolutely in position to, start any more front in a situation where they are already trying to deal with their economic and health challenges. So I don't think that's an opportune time. It's a bad time, and I don't think therefore India would have any reason and any motivation to think of opening any of the tensions with the neighboring country. The last we were seeing was fantastic informal summits between Indian Prime Minister and President Xi Jinping.
All right.
Very different relationships. So this has come obviously as a surprise to India, and I don't think there would be any reason for India to think of ratcheting up these kind of equations on the border with China.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Singh. And Mr. Rong, how are the Indian and Chinese domestic public opinions affecting the approaches of the two governments? Probably we see national sentiment rising probably on both sides. Are they helpful? Are they harmful? What is your thoughts?
Well, naturally, I think incidents or disputes like that will raise a kind of uproar from the from the public opinion. But I have to point out, I think as far as I can see, that the Indian side, the government in particular, should have done more in reining the public opinion. And this is a very critical lesson that China and India should have learned. And I hope they've learned. I mean, if we look at what happened, the 1962, the boundary, the border dispute, conflict, a lot of observers agreed that the part of the reason was because the government at that time of India was not being able to rein in the public opinion, rather than being pressurized by the public opinion to, I think, to the extent that they push for the so-called forward policy. So the Chinese side, as I think we can notice, made it repeatedly clear that they hope that the Indian side would manage the public opinion well, and so that the cool-mindedness would prevail. And it is true, I think, if you look at the Prime Minister Modi's sort of remarks a few months back, I think his statement that there's nobody had intruded into Indian territory, and nobody sort of captured a military post in India. Later on, there was such a backfire, in the sense that, I mean, his statement had to be sort of clarified. And this is another good way, I think, for managing this dispute like that. And of course, my view would be that if Indian government and the public media in particular take a view that I mean, helps the two governments, and particularly the diplomats of the two countries, and that would be, I think, the best. But I understand that our India colleagues will always argue that India is a kind of a society that a democracy, they are not able to do so, and so I'm not going to buy in a way like that.
We have Mr. Zuberi from Kathmandu joining us on the line. Mr. Zuberi, Nepal is also close to the areas disputed. What positions does your country take, and what influence does it have on this part of the world?
Thank you. You know, since China and India are very good neighbor for Nepal, Nepal is always maintaining its neutral position given our non-aligned foreign policy, and we always, ask those parties to, in the current disputes through negotiations and dialogues. That's our, I guess that's the best way that we are going for that.
But you also have territorial disputes with India, Nepal, I mean, and the Nepalese military is patrolling the tri-junction areas. What is it watching for?
Well, actually, I don't have any such information about military issue. But what I can say is that Nepal is going to, get back its land that Kalapani, Limpiadhura, and Lipulik Pass. that India had, claimed its own. But now Nepal is very committed to get that land back, and we have already, released our new political and administrative map in June. So I think there is no point that Nepal is really committed to get its land back.
So everybody will be defending their own national interest. That's understandable. But do you think there is kind of a principle underlying this kind of talks and negotiations?
There are so many things that should be done, but conversation, dialogue, and political negotiation is the must. And we should be very committed to in that disputes in a very peaceful manner. And I see no other options except dialogues and political levels meeting between Nepal and India. Even that applies even for China and India, I guess.
I know that Nepal has been close to India historically, but also Chinese investment in Nepal has been increasing in recent years. How do you see the trilateral relationship in terms of its future development?
That's a really very good question. Nepal is very cautious about its investment, and Nepal is really welcoming FDI from India as well as from China. And China is the largest FDI source for Nepal in the recent years. And so many Chinese firms and companies have been coming and bringing that investment in trade, in construction, and so many other things. So we welcome that. But this dispute, I believe, will have such serious repercussions on trade and investment in Nepal. The thing is that heavily depends on our own policy and programs and our own business environment, which Nepal is always committed to that issue.
Mr. Rong, let's also talk about the outside interference. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo seems to be taking the Indian side in the dispute with China, which Americans have been very careful not to taking sides in territorial disputes. So why do you think the U.S. is taking this stance?
Exactly. I think you made a very good point. I think usually the United States would not take a position on bilateral disputes like that. And it has been actually the position and the policy of the United States, even regarding the China and India boundary disputes. And so we have seen that's in the past few months since this incident, and the United States Secretary Pompeo has repeatedly making statement, taking sides on India against China. This is certainly not a responsible way, and it is not. I think and I think for observers can only make conclusions that the U.S. has a very that kind of hidden agenda, or would like to, as the saying goes, fish in the troubled water. Mm-hmm. And in the end, I think that does not serve the interest of the United States either. China and India are big countries. I think certainly neither China and India would like the United States to play such a kind of role.
On that note, I have to wrap up. Thank you very much, Mr. Rong. Thank you, Zuberi, for your wonderful analysis. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.